The neighborhood was the kind of place where mornings were quiet and evenings were calm. Streets were lined with tall, leafy trees, and houses with well-kept lawns gave the area a sense of order and peace. Most people knew each other by name, and greetings across fences or while jogging were normal. Life moved slowly, and everyone seemed to enjoy the quiet rhythm. Darnell had lived there for years. A retired military veteran, he had a reputation for being disciplined, polite, and helpful. People saw him walking through the streets, always in neat clothes, sometimes in his old service uniform. He had a calm presence, the kind that made people feel safe even without knowing much about him. Children would wave and neighbors would nod politely as he passed. Despite his quiet demeanor, there was a strength about him that made others respect him without needing to say a word. That particular morning, the sun was bright and the air had a crispness that made walking outside pleasant. Darnell decided to take his usual stroll. He walked slowly, carrying his service pistol in a holster, which he always did when he went for his walks. The gun was legal, properly licensed, and he was trained to use it safely. To him, it wasn't a weapon to intimidate anyone. It was a part of his preparation and safety routine. Across the street, a new HOA board member had recently moved into the neighborhood. She had quickly developed a reputation among some neighbors for being strict and controlling. People often whispered about her obsession with rules and appearances. She liked everything to be perfect according to her standards and rarely gave anyone the benefit of the doubt. That day, she was standing on her porch enjoying her morning coffee when she saw Darnell walking calmly down the street. Her attention immediately went to the gun in his holster. Panic surged through her. She didn't know him well, and all she saw was a man with a weapon walking through what she considered a safe, orderly neighborhood. Fear and assumptions took over her thoughts. Without stopping to consider who he was, why he carried it, or whether there was any actual threat, she picked up her phone and dialed 911. The voice on the other end of the line was calm, professional, but the words coming from her were sharp, rushed, and full of alarm. "There's a man with a gun walking down the street," she said. "I don't know him. He looks dangerous. You need to come right away." She described him in a way that made him sound like a threat, emphasizing the fact that he was black and carrying a weapon. As she spoke, neighbors started to peek out of their windows. The sound of her voice, the urgency, and her body language made people curious. Some were confused because they had seen Darnell before, always polite and quiet. Others felt uneasy because they didn't know what was happening. The tension started to rise even before the police arrived. Darnell, unaware that someone had called the police, continued his walk. He noticed the new neighbor watching him, her eyes wide and fixed on him in a way that felt uncomfortable. Normally, he would have nodded and smiled politely, but today he sensed something different. He could feel the tension, though he didn't yet know its cause. He kept walking calmly, hands visible, maintaining the same steady pace he always had. As he turned the corner, he could hear distant sirens. It was unusual for police to come to this part of the neighborhood unless there was an emergency. He stopped for a moment, assessing the situation. His training and experience told him to remain calm and composed, no matter what was happening. He knew that panic or aggression would only make things worse. Meanwhile, the HOA board member was growing more anxious. She imagined the worst-case scenarios in her head. What if he aimed the gun at someone? What if something terrible happened before the police arrived? Her fear was real to her, but it was based on assumptions rather than facts. She didn't see a retired veteran walking peacefully. She saw a threat she thought could harm her or her property. The first neighbors who understood what was happening tried to calm her down. "He's harmless," one whispered to another, shaking their head. "You've seen him before. He wouldn't do anything." But she ignored them, too focused on her fear. Her phone remained in her hand and she was giving every detail she could, determined to make sure the police responded immediately. As the sirens grew louder, more neighbors stepped outside. Some were curious, some were concerned, but most were confused. They had seen Darnell hundreds of times and knew him to be respectful. But the sight of the police rushing in made the situation feel urgent and dangerous. Children stopped playing in yards and people paused on their porches. The calm neighborhood had transformed into a place of tension within minutes. Darnell noticed the flashing lights approaching. He stopped, raised his hand slightly to show he meant no harm, and waited. His posture was calm but alert. He knew that people could misunderstand his intentions, and he wanted to make sure there was no confusion. Every step of the way, he maintained the same patience and respect that had defined him all his life. The police car pulled up near him, and officers stepped out, their movements professional and careful. They assessed the situation quickly, scanning the area and looking at Darnell. From a distance, the scene could have been misunderstood. A man with a gun and officers moving in. But the moment they saw Darnell, they noticed something that immediately changed their perception. Darnell's demeanor was not aggressive. It was disciplined. His uniform, his posture, and the calm way he held himself spoke volumes. They also recognized his veteran badge, a symbol of his service and training. In that instant, their caution turned into respect. What could have been a tense confrontation transformed into a moment of acknowledgement. Back on her porch, the HOA board member watched as the officers approached Darnell. She didn't yet understand what they had seen, and her anxiety was at its peak. She expected conflict, perhaps even confrontation, but instead, she noticed the officers nodding to him, almost as if they were greeting a colleague. Her confusion deepened, but she was too caught up in fear to process it yet. From the neighbors' perspective, the shift was remarkable. They had seen a man walking calmly, then the police responding, and finally the recognition between Darnell and the officers. Whispers spread through the crowd. He's a veteran. Oh, that's why they respect him. People started to realize how easily assumptions can mislead, how quickly fear can escalate a situation, and how calmness and integrity can diffuse potential conflict. Darnell continued to stand, hands visible, answering questions politely when the officers spoke. Every word he said was measured, respectful, and calm. He didn't shout, he didn't argue, and he didn't panic. It was clear to everyone watching that he posed no threat and that the tension had been unnecessary. The HOA board member slowly began to understand what had happened. Her fear, her assumptions, and her rush to call the police had made a peaceful situation look dangerous. She felt a mixture of embarrassment, relief, and guilt. The calm and respectful response from Darnell and the recognition from the officers highlighted the stark contrast between fear based on bias and reality based on understanding. By the time the situation settled, the neighborhood had shifted back to its normal pace, but the incident left a lasting impression. People discussed it for days afterward, not just about what had happened, but about how quickly assumptions can escalate, how important context is, and how respect and calmness can change the course of events. Darnell, true to his character, returned home without a complaint, without anger, and without resentment. He understood that fear and misunderstanding were part of human nature, and he chose to respond with patience and dignity. The incident became a lesson for the neighborhood, showing that calm and integrity often speak louder than panic and assumption. Even though the neighborhood returned to its usual quiet, something had changed. People began to notice Darnell differently, not just as a neighbor, but as someone whose life and actions carried lessons about patience, respect, and the cost of quick judgments. And for the HOA board member, it was a humbling reminder that appearances and assumptions can sometimes blind us to the truth right in front of our eyes. That day, the calm neighborhood had experienced tension, fear, and misunderstanding, but it had also witnessed a quiet demonstration of integrity and respect. And as Darnell walked past his neighbors in the days that followed, his presence was a subtle, powerful reminder of the difference between perception and reality, fear and understanding, and prejudice and respect. The sound of sirens echoed through the neighborhood, cutting through the usual quiet. Neighbors paused in their routines, some leaving porches and yards to see what was happening. Cars slowed as they passed, people craning their necks to get a glimpse of the scene unfolding. The quiet streets, which only moments ago had felt so peaceful, were now filled with tension and curiosity. Darnell stopped walking as he saw the police car approaching. He raised his hand slightly to show that he meant no harm. His posture was calm and composed, yet alert. Years of military training had taught him how to handle situations like this. Even when he was out in public, he understood how easily fear and misunderstanding could escalate. His calmness contrasted sharply with the growing anxiety around him. The officers stepped out of the car quickly but carefully, their eyes scanning the surroundings. They had received a call about a man with a gun, and their training told them to be cautious. They approached Darnell slowly, keeping their hands near their equipment but not pointing directly at him. Every movement was professional, precise, and controlled. From across the street, the HOA board member was watching with a mix of fear and expectation. She had imagined a dramatic confrontation, maybe even violence, but nothing seemed to happen. Her heart raced as she watched the officers draw closer. Every step they took seemed to heighten the tension, and she could hardly breathe as she waited for something to go wrong. Neighbors were now gathering on their porches, quietly observing the scene. Some whispered to one another, sharing what they knew about Darnell. "That's Darnell," one neighbor said. "He's retired military. He's never caused trouble." Others nodded, though some were unsure what to believe. Fear had a way of clouding judgment, and even well-meaning neighbors could feel anxious in uncertain moments. Darnell stopped at a safe distance from the officers. His hands remained visible and his posture was relaxed but alert. One of the officers called out calmly, "Sir, can you step over here and show us your identification?" Darnell responded respectfully, "Of course, officers. I'm happy to cooperate." He moved slowly, deliberately, making sure every movement could be clearly seen. The officers approached him, taking note of the holstered gun. Their expressions remained professional, but their eyes softened as they saw Darnell's uniform and the badge pinned to it. It was a veteran's badge, a symbol of his service and experience. In that moment, their perception shifted. What could have been a dangerous situation now felt different. They saw a man who had trained to handle weapons safely, someone who knew how to stay calm under pressure. The HOA board member's anxiety peaked as she watched the officers interact with Darnell. She noticed their body language change, their shoulders relaxing, their tone becoming more respectful. She felt a mix of confusion and panic. How could her call, which had seemed so urgent, now appear unnecessary? She could feel the weight of her assumptions pressing down on her. Darnell handed the officers his identification and badge. One of the officers examined it carefully, then looked up at him and gave a subtle nod. The other officer stepped closer and saluted him. It was a simple gesture, but it spoke volumes. Recognition of service, respect earned through experience, and acknowledgement of calm professionalism, all were conveyed in that small movement. The HOA board member froze. She could hardly believe what she was seeing. Her fear and assumptions had been completely misplaced. The man she had perceived as a threat was someone who commanded respect from trained officers. Her cheeks flushed with embarrassment, but she was too stunned to respond immediately. Neighbors who had been watching started to whisper again, this time sharing a different perspective. "He's a veteran," one said. "See how the officers are treating him? He's not a threat at all." Others nodded, murmuring their agreement. It became clear that the situation had shifted dramatically. What had started as fear and tension was now turning into admiration and respect. Darnell remained calm throughout the interaction. He answered the officers' questions politely, explaining that he was on his usual walk and that the gun he carried was for personal safety, legally owned and properly licensed. He didn't raise his voice or appear defensive. His calm demeanor was a stark contrast to the panic that had erupted moments earlier. The officers continued to speak with him briefly, ensuring that everything was in order. They thanked him for his cooperation and professionalism. Their body language and tone conveyed not just respect but reassurance. They had responded to a report of a possible threat and found a disciplined, responsible individual instead. Meanwhile, the HOA board member began to realize the full extent of her mistake. Fear and assumptions had led her to call the police unnecessarily, and she could see how her actions had escalated a situation that could have been handled differently. She felt a mixture of guilt, relief, and shame. Darnell, however, showed no anger or resentment. His calm, respectful demeanor served as a silent lesson, teaching her and the neighbors the importance of understanding before judgment. As the officers prepared to leave, Darnell thanked them politely for responding and for their professionalism. The salutes and nods from the officers remained a visible sign of respect, a recognition that went beyond words. For the neighbors who had watched, it was a moment that would not be forgotten, a reminder that appearances could be deceiving and that fear often arose from misunderstanding rather than fact. The neighborhood, which had been tense and anxious just moments before, slowly began to return to its normal rhythm. Children resumed playing, cars continued down the streets, and the calm routine of suburban life reemerged. But the lesson of that morning lingered. People had seen how quickly assumptions could escalate tension and how a measured, Respectful response could change everything. Darnell walked away from the scene quietly, maintaining the same calm and composure he had shown all along. He returned home without complaint, without confrontation, and without resentment. His actions had spoken louder than any words could, showing the neighborhood the power of patience, respect, and integrity. The HOA board member stood on her porch for a long moment, reflecting on what had happened. She realized that fear and assumptions could lead to unnecessary tension, and she felt the weight of responsibility for her actions. For the first time, she truly understood the importance of context and the need to see people for who they really are, not just who we assume them to be. As neighbors discussed the incident over the following days, the story spread quietly but meaningfully. It became an example of how quick judgments and fear could create unnecessary conflict, and how understanding, patience, and respect could resolve it. People began to look at Darnell differently, not just as a neighbor, but as someone who carried lessons about calmness, integrity, and strength. The officer's recognition of Darnell left a lasting impression on everyone who had seen it. It was a reminder that experience, training, and character earned respect, and that such qualities could turn fear into understanding. Even the HOA board member, who had sparked the situation with her call, carried that lesson forward, reflecting on how she could handle things differently in the future. In the end, the incident became more than just a moment of tension. It became a teaching moment for the neighborhood. It reminded everyone that assumptions could mislead, that fear could escalate quickly, and that calm, respectful behavior could restore balance. Darnell's quiet strength, patience, and integrity became a story that neighbors would remember for years. A story of respect earned through character, not assumptions or fear. The neighborhood returned to its normal rhythm, but the lesson lingered. People started noticing Darnell in a new light, not just as the retired veteran who walked through their streets, but as someone whose presence reminded them to pause, observe, and understand before acting. For the HOA board member, it was a humbling lesson that reshaped her perspective. For the neighbors, it was a quiet but powerful reminder that appearances could be misleading and that respect, patience, and integrity could change the course of any situation. Even as life continued, the story of that morning remained a part of the neighborhood's memory, a story of tension, misunderstanding, and ultimately respect. It served as a reminder that even in small communities, moments of fear could teach lessons of patience and humanity, and that sometimes the quietest people carry the loudest lessons. As the officers continued to speak with Darnell, something remarkable happened. The tension that had gripped the neighborhood just moments before began to dissolve. The officers' initial caution slowly gave way to recognition and respect. It started with subtle gestures, a nod here, a shift in posture there, but soon became obvious to everyone watching. One of the officers, noticing the veteran badge pinned neatly on Darnell's uniform, straightened and raised his hand in a crisp salute. The gesture was small, almost formal, yet it carried immense meaning. It wasn't just a salute to a man in uniform. It was a salute to the years he had served, to the discipline he carried, and to the calm authority that now filled the air. The other officer followed suit, giving a short but firm nod, signaling acknowledgement and respect. The HOA board member, who had been standing rigidly on her porch, felt a sudden jolt of disbelief. Her eyes widened and her hand tightened around her coffee cup. The fear that had driven her actions just minutes ago now collided with embarrassment and shock. She had called the police, insisting that Darnell was dangerous, and now she watched as trained officers treated him with honor and courtesy. Neighbors who had gathered on porches and lawns could barely believe what they were seeing. Some whispered to each other, their voices low but tinged with awe. "Did you see that?" "They just saluted him," one neighbor said. Another shook their head. "I can't believe we almost judged him wrong." Children who had been peeking through fences tilted their heads, curious and confused by the formal display, sensing that something important was happening. Darnell remained calm as he always did. He responded to the officers with measured words and steady eye contact. "Thank you, officers. I appreciate your respect," he said, his voice quiet but sincere. There was no arrogance in his tone, no hint of pride. Instead, there was a quiet dignity that radiated naturally, a dignity that had been built over years of service and life experience. The officers, now fully aware of who they were dealing with, began to relax. Their posture softened, and their voices lost the edge of caution they had carried when they first arrived. They asked a few more questions, confirming his identity and explaining why they had come, but their tone was now courteous rather than suspicious. It was clear that Darnell's calm presence and veteran status had shifted the dynamic entirely. The HOA board member's mind raced. She could feel the weight of her mistake pressing down on her chest. She had acted out of fear, influenced by assumptions and bias, and the reality of the situation now left her feeling small. Her coffee cup trembled slightly in her hand, and she lowered her gaze, unwilling to meet Darnell's eyes. She felt exposed, as though everyone could see her error. Yet even in that moment, Darnell showed no anger toward her. His calmness extended beyond the officers to the entire scene. He didn't scold her or demand an apology. He simply carried himself with the same steady demeanor that had earned the officers' respect. His behavior was a silent reminder of the power of patience and integrity, demonstrating that one could rise above fear and misjudgment without hostility. Neighbors began to murmur among themselves, reflecting on what they had witnessed. "I can't believe she called the police on him for nothing," one said. "And look at how respectful the officers are. He's clearly someone who deserves it." Others nodded, realizing how quickly assumptions and fear could escalate tension. The contrast between Darnell's calm professionalism and the HOA board member's panic was striking. The officers now engaged in a brief but meaningful conversation with Darnell. They asked about his routine, his training, and his experience, and he responded openly, explaining his walks, his legal ownership of the firearm, and the importance of staying disciplined and alert. He spoke with humility, never boasting, but the depth of his experience and the clarity of his character shone through. As the conversation continued, the officers' respect became more visible. They offered small gestures of acknowledgement, a nod, a short smile, a few words of genuine appreciation. It was a quiet but powerful display of recognition, one that communicated far more than any words could. It signaled to everyone watching that Darnell's life and service mattered, that his calm and disciplined approach had earned him respect, and that assumptions based on appearances could not capture the truth. The HOA board member, still standing on her porch, began to understand the full impact of her actions. She had let fear and assumptions drive her decisions, and now she saw the consequences. There was no anger from Darnell, no aggression from the officers, yet the weight of her error was undeniable. It was a humbling moment, one that forced her to reflect deeply on how she viewed others and the dangers of acting without understanding. Meanwhile, the neighborhood watched quietly. Some people nodded to each other, exchanging knowing looks. The story unfolding before them was a lesson in perception, respect, and integrity. A man who had been feared moments ago was now being recognized for his service and his character. The scene was a reminder that appearances could be misleading, and that understanding and patience could transform fear into admiration. Darnell, sensing the lingering tension from the HOA board member, addressed the situation gently. "I understand why you might have been concerned," he said quietly. "But I hope this shows that calm and understanding can prevent unnecessary fear. Everyone deserves the benefit of the doubt." His words were soft, yet they carried weight. They were a reminder that one could respond to fear and misunderstanding with dignity and patience rather than anger. The officers nodded, acknowledging both his words and his composure. "You handled that very well," one said. "Thank you for staying calm and respectful. It makes all the difference in situations like this." Their words reinforced the lesson that Darnell's integrity and professionalism had diffused what could have been a tense and dangerous encounter. As the moment continued, the HOA board member felt a growing sense of shame, but also a sense of realization. She had allowed fear and assumptions to control her actions, but she was witnessing the power of calmness, respect, and understanding firsthand. It was a lesson she could not ignore. The salute from the officers, the neighbors' recognition, and Darnell's steady demeanor all combined to create a moment of clarity for her, a moment that would shape how she approached situations in the future. Some neighbors approached, cautiously at first, then with more confidence. They thanked Darnell for his patience and for setting such a strong example of how to handle tense situations. Children waved and adults smiled, all expressing a quiet acknowledgement of the lesson unfolding. The scene had shifted from fear and tension to respect and understanding. Darnell responded politely to every gesture, never appearing proud or boastful. He understood the subtle power of his behavior, the way calmness, patience, and integrity could speak louder than any words. His actions left a lasting impression on the neighborhood, showing that fear could be met with understanding, and that respect could be earned through conduct rather than assumption. Even the HOA board member eventually lowered herself from her rigid posture and approached cautiously. Her voice was soft, almost hesitant. I'm sorry for overreacting," she said. "I didn't understand and I jumped to conclusions." Darnell nodded, accepting her apology without resentment. His response was calm, measured, and human, an example of empathy and understanding that reinforced the lesson for everyone watching. The officers, satisfied that everything was in order, prepared to leave. Before they did, they exchanged another salute with Darnell, a final gesture of respect that cemented the moment. The neighborhood witnessed a quiet but powerful demonstration of honor, integrity, and patience. What had begun as fear and misunderstanding ended with recognition and respect, a complete reversal of the initial tension. As the officers drove away, the HOA board member remained on her porch, reflecting deeply on what had happened. She understood now that assumptions, fear, and bias could escalate situations unnecessarily. She saw clearly how patience, calmness, and respect could diffuse tension and earn admiration. The contrast between her panic and Darnell's composure left her with a lesson that would not be easily forgotten. Neighbors slowly returned to their routines, but the story lingered. People discussed what had happened, emphasizing the importance of understanding before judgment and the power of calm integrity. Darnell's actions became a quiet example of how one person's behavior could transform an entire community's perception, turning fear into respect, tension into admiration, and misunderstanding into clarity. In the days that followed, the incident was still on people's minds. Children recounted the police salute, adults reflected on Darnell's patience, and even the HOA board member carried the memory of that moment with her. A reminder of how important it is to pause, observe, and understand before acting. Darnell's calm, measured response and the recognition he received had not only diffused a tense situation, but it also taught a lesson that extended far beyond that morning's encounter. By the end of the day, the neighborhood had returned to its quiet rhythm, but the lesson of that encounter remained. Darnell had shown that respect could be earned through conduct, that patience could diffuse fear, and that understanding could replace assumptions. The officer's salute was a small but powerful symbol of recognition, and the entire community had witnessed the impact of one man's integrity. It was a day that reminded everyone that appearances could be misleading, that fear could escalate quickly, and that calm, respectful behavior could change everything. Darnell walked back to his home quietly, as always, leaving behind a neighborhood that had learned something important about patience, understanding, and respect. After the incident with the police and the salute, the neighborhood slowly began to settle back into its normal rhythm. The streets were quiet again. Children resumed their play in yards, and cars moved along the roads without hesitation. But even as life seemed to return to normal, the memory of that morning lingered in the minds of the neighbors. People couldn't stop talking about what had happened, not just about Darnell, but about the way fear, assumptions, and understanding had all collided in that brief but powerful moment. Neighbors gathered in small groups, chatting across fences or on front porches. Some shared their confusion at first, remembering how tense the situation had been, while others expressed relief that no one had been hurt. "I can't believe how quickly things escalated," one neighbor said. "We all saw it. The moment she called the police, everyone assumed the worst." Another nodded, adding, "And then to see the officers salute him. It was a complete shift. I've never seen anything like it." The story spread quietly through the neighborhood. People who had only observed from windows began to reflect on their own assumptions. They realized how easy it was to let fear take control, to make judgments based on appearances rather than facts. Darnell had remained calm and respectful throughout, showing everyone the power of patience and dignity. His actions had turned what could have been a tense confrontation into a lesson for the entire community. Meanwhile, the HOA board member was facing her own internal struggle. She spent hours thinking about what had happened and the role she had played in escalating the situation. Her fear had been real to her, but she understood that it had been amplified by assumptions and bias. She felt embarrassed, guilty, and unsettled. realizing that her actions had caused unnecessary stress for her neighbors and for Darnell. After taking time to reflect, she decided to address the situation directly. She went door to door, apologizing to neighbors who had witnessed her actions and acknowledging that she had overreacted. "I let fear get the best of me," she admitted quietly. "I didn't know enough about him and I jumped to conclusions. I hope everyone can understand that I didn't mean any harm, but I know I caused unnecessary tension." Some neighbors accepted her apology, nodding and murmuring that they appreciated her honesty. Others remained silent, still processing what they had seen and experienced. The most important conversation, however, was between her and Darnell. She approached him cautiously, her voice soft and hesitant. "I want to apologize," she said. "I overreacted and misjudged you. I see now that you're nothing like what I imagined, and I'm truly sorry." Darnell looked at her calmly, his expression gentle and understanding. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I know fear can make people react without thinking. I appreciate your apology. It takes courage to admit when we're wrong." That simple exchange spoke volumes to the neighborhood. People who witnessed it realized that accountability, humility, and honesty could go a long way in restoring trust and respect. The HOA board member's willingness to acknowledge her mistake became a quiet example of personal growth, showing that even when fear and bias take over, it's possible to learn and change. As days passed, neighbors began discussing Darnell's response in greater detail. They admired the way he had handled the situation, calm, polite, and unwavering. He had never shouted, argued, or acted defensively. His restraint had transformed what could have been a chaotic incident into a demonstration of patience and dignity. Parents told their children about his example, emphasizing the importance of staying calm in tense situations and treating everyone with respect. The officers who had interacted with Darnell were also spoken about in conversations around the neighborhood. People appreciated their professionalism and the way they had recognized his service and discipline. The salute in particular became a focal point of discussion. It wasn't just a formality. It was a sign of recognition, a powerful gesture that acknowledged the years of service, skill, and integrity that Darnell carried. For neighbors who had witnessed it, the salute became a symbol of respect, humility, and human connection. Darnell, for his part, continued with his routine. He walked through the neighborhood as he always had, calm and composed, yet he noticed subtle changes in the way people greeted him. Neighbors now waved with a little more warmth, some even pausing to say hello and express appreciation for the way he had handled the situation. It was clear that the incident had shifted the community's perception of him, not just as a veteran, but as a person whose integrity and composure set an example for everyone. Some neighbors who had previously been hesitant or cautious about him began to reflect on their own biases. They realized that assumptions based on appearances or fear could cloud judgment and create unnecessary tension. Darnell's calm response had shown them the importance of patience, understanding, and empathy. Conversations about the incident became less about fear and more about lessons in human behavior and respect. The HOA board member, now more aware of her impact, took additional steps to ensure that similar situations wouldn't arise in the future. She suggested changes to the HOA's communication policies, emphasizing the need to verify facts and consider context before escalating situations. She encouraged neighbors to approach each other directly when concerns arose, rather than relying on assumptions or fear. Her actions showed that personal accountability could lead to positive changes in a broader community. Children in the neighborhood also learned from the incident. They watched how adults responded to fear, mistakes, and recognition. They saw Darnell's calm and respectful behavior and the officer's acknowledgement as a model for how to handle tense situations. The lessons were subtle but lasting. Patience, respect, and understanding could diffuse fear, and integrity could earn admiration in ways that words alone could not. As the days turned into weeks, the neighborhood slowly regained its usual calm, but the incident remained a topic of quiet reflection. People would occasionally mention it when chatting, not to gossip but to highlight the lessons they had learned. Conversations focused on empathy, understanding, and the importance of recognizing character over appearances. Darnell's actions had left a lasting impression, and the salute from the officers remained a symbol of respect that the neighborhood would remember for years. The incident also prompted some deeper self-reflection among the neighbors. Many realized that moments of fear and misunderstanding could happen to anyone, and that the key was how one responded. Darnell's calmness, humility, and dignity had turned a potentially negative situation into a lesson for the whole community. It was a reminder that respect, patience, and understanding were more powerful than assumptions, fear, or snap judgments. Even the HOA board member began to change the way she viewed the neighborhood and its residents. She recognized the value of seeing people for who they really were, rather than making judgments based on fear or bias. She worked to rebuild trust with neighbors and to approach her role with more humility and understanding. Her growth became part of the broader story, a story of accountability, learning, and positive change. Darnell, quietly going about his life, never sought recognition or praise. He continued his walks, volunteered occasionally, and greeted neighbors politely. But his impact was felt throughout the community. People remembered how he had handled the police encounter, how he had remained calm, and how he had treated everyone, even the person who had misjudged him, with patience and respect. His actions became a living lesson in integrity and human decency. Over time, the story of that morning transformed into something more than just an incident. It became a teaching moment, a shared experience that reminded the neighborhood of the importance of context, patience, and empathy. The salute from the officers was not just a gesture. It symbolized the recognition of character, training, and restraint. For everyone who witnessed it, it was a lesson that would remain long after the moment had passed. Neighbors began to see each other differently. They were more cautious about jumping to conclusions, more patient in assessing situations, and more willing to extend understanding to those they didn't know well. The incident had sparked a quiet but meaningful cultural shift in the neighborhood, one based on respect, empathy, and the acknowledgement of human dignity. Even in quiet moments, when people walked past Darnell or saw him tending to his daily routines, they were reminded of that morning. His calm demeanor, the officer's salute, and the lessons learned from fear and misunderstanding lingered in the air like an invisible thread connecting the community. It was a subtle yet powerful reminder that integrity and patience could influence not only individuals, but entire communities. By the time the neighborhood fully returned to its routine, the story had been told and retold in different ways. Some recounted the moment of the salute, others focused on Darnell's calm demeanor, and still others reflected on the growth of the HOA board member. Every retelling emphasized the same core lessons. Fear can mislead, assumptions can harm, and respect, patience, and integrity can transform even the tensest situations into moments of learning and connection. In the end, the incident left the neighborhood stronger and more connected. People had seen firsthand how one person's calmness and integrity could turn fear into understanding. They had witnessed accountability and growth, both in the officers and in the HOA board member. And they had learned that respect, patience, and empathy could reshape not just one encounter but the culture of an entire community. Darnell's quiet presence became a symbol of that transformation. The neighborhood, once tense and fearful in that moment, had become reflective, empathetic, and more aware. The story of the morning, the police salute, and the lessons learned remained a part of the neighborhood's memory, a living reminder of the power of calm, patience, and understanding. Days turned into weeks, and life in the neighborhood slowly returned to its usual calm. Streets once again rang with the laughter of children, the hum of cars passing by, and the occasional greetings between neighbors. Yet beneath this calm, the memory of that morning lingered. The incident with Darnell, the police, and the HOA board member had left a mark on everyone who had witnessed it. It wasn't just about fear or misunderstanding anymore. It had become a story about respect, integrity, and the power of human character. Darnell continued his daily walks, carrying himself with the same calm, disciplined presence that had defined him for years. He noticed that neighbors greeted him differently now, not out of fear but with genuine warmth and recognition. People who had once been wary smiled and nodded, some even stopping to exchange a few words. Children waved eagerly, having heard from